Hello, my international people. This is Louise Uwachu broadcasting live from Vancouver, Canada. And today we are April 26, 2012. It's 5 p.m. Pacific time. Welcome to the show. And we're so happy to have everyone with us today. Thank you, listeners. Thank you to our guests. Today's show is about democracy or hypocrisy, and we're going to examine the case of Mali to see what exactly is going on Mali. If you have been following, a lot of things have happened in Mali. A lot of people think what they think, so we're going to bring in our own experts to tell you what they think is really happening in Mali. Now, our first guest today is Chris Street. Chris Street is, you will discover for yourself, he's a very talented speaker and writer about economic and social issues, and he will be telling you about what he thinks, according to his own analysis of the situation, is going on in Mali. And then in the second part of the show, we will have Jim Burrows. Jim Burrows is a director, producer, cinematographer who has made Shadow of Afghanistan, and he also has a 14-part series on Africa currently happening. He will tell you more about that. And so let's get into it already and bring in Chris Street. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Louise. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for being on the show. How are you?
Very good.
That's very nice to hear. Now, let's start by telling people who you are.
Well, my background is I was an investment banker, and then I guess I grew up and I became president and chairman of two New York Stock Exchange companies. And in my old age, I started writing books. I have a current book out called The Third Way, which is basically how to restructure government. And I write extensively for the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Big Government, Huffington Post, and other major publications really across the world now.
That's really excellent. So you pretty much always know what's happening before the rest of the people know what's happening.
Well, Louise, as an economist, I think that President Truman said I always wanted a one-arm economist, so I couldn't say on the other hand. But for my talent or my efforts really are to try to step back from big economic issues and try to understand what I call the driver, the real reason that people take action.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, war is always economically motivated. So there's no separating economics and politics and war.
Well, war is just a different form of diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know who's the famous quote that says the war is a continuation of politics by other means. Correct.
The same could. If you have the power, you would actually use it, and that's one of the challenges. That there's a big chessboard out there, and then there's a bunch of little chessboards. I think that Mali is an example of how a big chessboard movement caused a lot of friction and damage on the small chessboards.
Okay. Now, yes, let's get into the situation of Mali. Now, you're saying that the situation in Mali is related more than anything to the Federal Reserve economic policies and monetary policies.
Well, that's correct. People don't understand that some of the actions that the American empire takes, and I don't say that as a pejorative word. America is the accidental empire, and we never wanted to be an empire. We never desired to be an empire. We just end up sort of winning two wars, and because of that situation, we found ourselves in a powerful position. And our first real activity in the Middle East, for your listeners, that the British basically controlled the oil in the Middle East prior to World War II. They'd set up the British Iranian Oil Company, and they gave Iran 20% of the oil and kept 80% of the oil, and had the right to oil all their British ships and only British technicians could control the technology of oil in the Middle East. And after World War II, America came in and did 50% deals and pretty much took over the Middle East and all the way through Africa. And as part of that effort, America found itself dealing with historic European ties that were basically in northern Africa. And as our relationship with these areas progressed, America had a strong relationship and a strong sense of partnership with Africa. But as things have played out over the last, say, 15 years, the focus of America has turned away from the long-term conflict with communism and really turned towards Asia. And for Asia, America cut a deal along with Japan and Europe in the early 1990s as the Soviet Union was collapsing. The United States and Europe and Japan allowed China to devalue their currency by 67% and get access to world markets. And, of course, anything that goes from costing $1 and the next day it costs 33 cents is going to be highly compelling. And this relationship grew and grew and grew. And during the early 2000s, it was a very positive relationship. But after the Great Recession started, it was expected that China, as it matured and as economy got larger, they would allow their currency to essentially become stronger, to recapture part of that big discount back. And in 2009 and 2010, China went on a buying binge and bought a spectacular amount of U.S. government bonds, actually drove the U.S. dollar higher and made Chinese goods much, much cheaper and, of course, cost American jobs. And people do not understand that the American government has a very big foot, and one of the ways that we retaliated against China in a near military fashion was something called quantitative easing 2. Now, quantitative easing 2 baffled most people around the world, but its real goal was not to simply spend U.S. dollars. It was to essentially create a short-term inflation spike around the world, because China, about 42% of China's disposable income goes to food. And, of course, in the U.S., it's probably something like 10 or 12%. It was a very effective policy. It caused tremendous turmoil in China. It forced the Chinese to stop trying to drive the U.S. dollar up. But unfortunately, the weakest point in the world for a commodity spike was not China and Asia. It was the Middle East, where some countries have as much as 60% of their disposable income for their population goes to food. And I believe that the Arab Spring, which is an interesting word to use, for some people it's spring and for some people it's their nightmare. But this huge spike in food prices essentially destroyed the government stability, especially along North Africa. And as it was destroyed along North Africa, the places it hit first were Algeria, Morocco, and Libya. And Libya has a long history of having a relationship with what are called the Tuareg peoples of Mali and Nigeria and Algeria. And Colonel Gaddafi hired those people as his mercenaries. And so when Libya had political turmoil and essentially the eastern part of Libya rebelled against the western part of Libya, that the Tuareg people left at the end of the war and took all their heavy weapons and heavy training and went down to Mali and changed their name, and now they've essentially become revolutionaries and taken over the country of Mali.
I see. So what you're pretty much saying is that it's the food prices that are causing all this, and the food prices is from an economic policy of the Federal Reserve against China. So this has nothing to do with anybody else in the world, not Mali, not Libya, not Iran, not the British. This is between America and China?
Well, it was what you'd call a large chessboard move, a near military retaliation, something that was so painful to the Chinese to get their attention and stop the Chinese from stealing jobs from the United States.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand, the American people only spend 10 to 12% on their food, and the people in the Middle East and Africa spend 50 to 60% on their food?
Well, it's actually higher in the Middle East than even in Africa. Africa tends to be the growing part of Africa, especially as you get to the middle and south, has very good food resources. But of course, the Middle East has very poor food resources, and the first real explosion of turmoil from this policy hit in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. So the people in the Middle East spend over 50% of their income on food.
Morocco is actually closer to 60%. Libya is probably 49%. Algeria is about 52%. So these are very, very high numbers, even for the developing world.
Any ideas on how much Mali spends on food?
I think Mali, actually, I looked it up this morning, and it looks to be something around 38 to 40%. So they're closer to China.
Okay. So which means when you spend this much money on food, it's very important how much food costs.
Yeah, you feel it immediately. A family feels this immediately, and it has a tremendous short-term impact on their well-being. Because, of course, at first you try to avoid cutting back on food, and then pretty quickly you actually have to start conserving on your purchases of food.
I see. So now, what exactly would be the advice to the people of Mali? Because they think some people think there's a revolution going on, and some people think the country is going to be separated. Is this related to anything that has to do with them? Can they do something about their own situation?
Well, I think that for the Tuareg tribesmen who served in Gaddafi's military, they were trained to Western levels of expertise in military strategy. Colonel Gaddafi had a fairly modern army, lots of mechanized vehicles and lots of heavy weapons, and the Tuareg tribesmen took those weapons with them, and so they've established themselves as the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, the MNLA, but many people think they're really Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb.
Mm-hmm. So they have nothing at all to do with democracy or liberation or independence or freedom.
Well, if you're a Tuareg tribesman and you have heavy weapons, you think you've just had a freedom movement, but the Tuaregs actually are a minority in Mali, but once again a very powerfully trained military with nowhere else to go. I
see. Now, who do you think is using them? Are they getting support from NATO? Because there were reports that NATO is involved behind this and that the American government is militarily involved.
Well, I would think that the last thing the U.S. government wants or NATO wants is a radical, spectacularly armed and trained force in Western Africa, because this morning, I think, or yesterday, you just had Guinea-Bissau has just had another coup, and you're getting real pushback from Algeria, where there's a very large Tuareg tribal population. So these things tend to go in waves, and I think it's very interesting that you would have a show on Mali, because most people don't understand that its strategic position and the fact that you've had these revolutions in Egypt and now turmoil in Syria. In the last couple of weeks, there's been trouble in Jordan. I'm sure that we'll have more trouble in Algeria with the Tuaregs, but these areas historically had actually been what's called disarmed. There's been, in the 70s, and perhaps even the early 80s, there were lots of freedom movements, and you've somewhat through better economy and more stability, this had been a quiet part of the world. With the overthrow of Libya and the overthrow of Egypt, you now have a massive amount of arms and being sold and being redistributed across the African plains. And I think you're going to have tremendous trouble over the next 5 years. Once you let these things out of the box, they don't tend to go back in easily.
So the situation has only started, and you are predicting that they will be arming the population in Mali, and most probably also starving the population in Mali so they can revolt, or that the population can, then boil up.
Louise, you're breaking up?
Yes, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. You sound fine. Well, yes, I think this is a major issue. It's interesting that Nigeria is actually negotiating with the Tuareg because they already have a large Muslim population in Nigeria, and they're not looking for trouble, I guess is the right way to say it. On the other hand, Algeria has basically said that either a radical Islam government in Mali is that they won't allow. So these things tend to have go in waves. The first wave, of course, is the shock that a small group of extremely well-armed, well-organized, and well-trained fighters with nothing to lose could basically take over a country almost the size of France in almost light speed.
Yeah.
Now you have a situation where other forces are arming to react, and neighbors are trying to understand how to readjust. But once you take this genie out of the bottle of, tribesmen can win, this thing gets around.
Mm-hmm. What would be the strategy in order for the usual people, the regular people, not to be held hostage in the middle of all this? How can they survive and not be held hostage?
Well, I don't really think they have a choice. It's clear that Mali was a nice little country that was relatively poor. A lot of it's literally Sahara, and all of a sudden one day they're exposed to a Western-style mechanized army that ran over the country, and some pretty darn ferocious fighters who'd just been through a heavy military campaign in Libya. So I think most people in Mali are probably in shock right now, and unfortunately there's not a lot of Western aid that will be able to get in. So you're going to go through a period of very difficult lives for these people.
Mm-hmm. And no food. Is that what you're saying? Or is there going to be some sort of famine targeted towards West Africa?
Well, the problem is once you start having military turmoil, food becomes an issue because, of course, the price of food goes up. And having said that, you already had inflation in the Middle East. Mali, before the invasion of the Tuareg tribesmen, had reasonable cost for food and was a reasonably productive country. I don't know the costs right now, but I assume if there's a retaliation by Algeria and a prolonged military confrontation with the Tuareg, that it's going to be hard on the people and food's going to be a big issue.
I see. Now, if the Federal Reserve, if the American government had a different policy, economic policy, would this change things, or would it take for the countries in the rest of the world to get out of the global economic system in order to change things? Because if you're in this global economic system, then everything that America decides affects the rest of the world. But if you get out, is that a way to save yourself, save your country?
Well, people can talk what they want to say about the United States, but the United States is still 25% of the gross national product of the world. And that is such a big footprint. I mean, China, for its 1.3 billion people, is less than a third of the size of the economy of the United States. So you cannot avoid collateral damage if two titans like China and the United States get in a economic disagreement. And so that's, I think, what people don't quite understand, that for the United States, we could have accepted another 5% unemployment and China taking a greater amount of market share, and that just wasn't sustainable. And the way in modern worlds, you don't take a country over usually by military, you take it over by corporation and economics. That the United States retaliated with the best tools it had to achieve its own interests. And I think that when you talk to people at the State Department level, there really was no choice. Either do something about China, or you would quickly end up in a real confrontation with the American people. You're becoming so angry that you could be in a military challenge. And unfortunately, for small countries through history have been run over by the geopolitics of large countries.
Now, so if I understand correct, one side of the conflict is supported by the Americans. Do you think there's going to be a side of the conflict that the Chinese support?
Well, no, I don't really agree with the issue that the Americans are supporting the Tuareg or the Americans. If anything, the Americans would tend to want the stability of the old government, but I don't know that there is enough opposition right now, generic opposition in Mali, to field a force as a counter-revolutionary force. One of the problems is the Tuaregs were so effective in such a short period of time that I think they caught the rest of the world pretty much by surprise. And the stakes on a worldwide level of what happens in Mali, unfortunately, are very, very small compared to the stakes, say, of what was going on in Iran. So Mali is a little corner of the world that even if the Americans and the Europeans want to respond in some kind of military way, it'll take them 6 to 8 months to get organized. So I don't perceive this as an American revolution. I see this as a unfortunate blowback from something that was very important to America and China that they sort of got run over by.
And you're saying, to you, Mali is just roadkill.
We used that term this afternoon. Unfortunately, I wasn't going to use that on the show, but that's probably a pretty fair statement. In the big world, Mali unfortunately got run over.
It got run over. Now, it's roadkill on the road to where? That's the question.
Well, that's always my concern, and that's one of the, as you know, Louise, my I guess skill or expertise, or what people seem to be interested in me in, is that I tend to be, 2 chess moves ahead.
That's great.
Well, when you're doing economics about what happened, you tend to be 100%. When you're looking over the valley, it tends to have a little more difficulty. But my take from the start was once you started fooling around with these regimes in the Middle East that for a long period of time had reached a level of stability, that the opposite of stability is chaos. And chaos is a spider, because when you have chaos in one country and there's 3 neighbors, you now have chaos in 4 countries. And I think that now that you've had chaos in Libya, you have chaos in Mali, you have chaos in Guinea-Bissau, I'm sure that Algeria is not going to put up with a radical Islamist regime in Mali, so that's going to be militarized. I would think the Nigerians are very, very concerned that the Islamic part of Nigeria is in the north, and it'll be infected by the Tuaregs, and you'll basically this spider web is going to grow, and a good part of Africa could be in for some rough times.
I see. Isn't that what the superpowers want anyways? Because Africa in chaos is precisely what they need in order to get all the things for cheap or for free.
Well, I mean, I understand that sort of Marxist approach, but most people believe that Africa is the next was expected to be the next cheap labor and manufacturing platform. Africa uniquely has tremendous energy supplies, but the energy supplies are in the north, away from the people in the south and in the west. So if the energy supplies and the people had been together like they are in Nigeria, you have a combination in Nigeria of industrialization plus energy. And urbanization. That's I think what big corporations want. They want more urbanization and greater opportunity, access to cheaper labor. But I don't think anyone who would want economically would find value as a world power in Africa in turmoil. As I said, people expected Africa to be the next Asia.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about gold? Because Mali is known for gold and oil.
Well, yes, Mali has oil resources, but they're not a commanding resource. Mali has other resources of gold. They also have molybdenum, I believe, and some other industrial metals that can be mined, but it's not as compelling as, say, South Africa. It's not enough to make it I guess you call it a capstone of international policy.
Mm-hmm. All right. So thank you so much, Chris. We're coming towards the end of your segment, and I want to tell people that they can find you on chrisstreetandcompany.com. Now, what would be your last words? What would you advise the people, the regular people of Mali? What would you advise them precaution measures to take?
Well, first of all, I think that America needs to apologize for the unfortunate collateral damage in geopolitics that the Mali people are going to suffer. For the Malis themselves, I think that they're in for a long period of military confrontation, and I think for the average Mali people, I think their life is going to be hard, and I'm sad that this part of Africa, which had tremendous promise, looks to me like it'll be caught up in military turmoil for some time.
I thank you so much, Chris. Well, the important thing is to warn the people. You have warned the people enough. So people who didn't know, people who thought that this was just a temporary conflict or there was going to be a democratic transition and this and that, at least they know they have a broader picture of the conflict, and they can be stronger and knowing what to expect, right?
Great. Nice to talk to you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Chris, and have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Hello, we are continuing on the show. You have heard from Chris. We're going to bring in now Jim Burrows. Good evening, Jim.
Good evening, Louise.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
So you have followed our previous conversation, and I'm sure you have a lot of comments about it.
Yes, I learned something very serious from Chris. I have known, or we have known, many of us who have been tramping through Africa for the last decade, that China is playing a bigger role there than ever. They're focusing on Africa. But Chris has actually given me some insight into why this is happening. So I think that's very valuable.
Exactly. So let's start by telling our listeners who you are. You're a filmmaker, producer, a cinematographer, and you have been around the world, all the continents, making documentaries which are much more reality than news, which means you usually know what's happening much more than we get the information that we get on the news. And your most interesting work that we have seen lately is Shadow of Afghanistan. Can we start by telling the people who you are and how you made this Shadow of Afghanistan and how you think that it may be related to the situation in Mali?
Well, it's very interesting. There are so many things in common between Afghanistan and Mali. The film we made in Afghanistan became sort of a passion of the heart. I mean, we basically were in there 19 times over a period of 22 years. And it's not often that you get the opportunity for a case study as to how things really happen. Well, Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and Mali is a landlocked country, surrounded by other countries that are concerned about what goes on, because in going back to the Kipling's early writings, you know that Afghanistan always brought a little fear to people because they're a pretty tough group of people. And they beat the British Empire twice, and they chased out the Russians. And in Mali at one point, back under the Songhai, starting in 1500s, I guess, was well, even back before then. You go to the 14th century and you find a huge empire under the Malinke, and basically they were the center of the, or at least the center of that point of the Sahel, which is the area that borders the southern Sahara.
Yes, the Malian Empire was the empire in that part of Africa for a very, very long time, and it's very historic and very glorious.
Absolutely, and it's a tremendous story to read about. So to this day, you have a lot of little countries around Afghanistan and a lot of little countries around Mali who are afraid of the kind of fallout that could hit them. The other thing that's very curious is that there's a lot of evidence, well, it's now becoming more than evidence, that Afghanistan's southern neighbor, Pakistan, has really been a big part of the problems too. And the people of Pakistan have gone through a terrible time because they never seem to be able to keep their democracy. It always ends up in the military hands. And the military, which in Afghanistan is run by the ISI, really, it's a separate government. It's called the Inter-Services. Basically, it's a secret service that combines all the military services. And what we are finding in that situation is a desire for total control over the situation. They would like to pick who runs Afghanistan. They'd like to pick where the pipelines are going to come through. And in Mali, you have, thanks to WikiLeaks actually, we know that there has been a great deal of interest from Algeria, Secret Service, spending a lot of time down in Mali with the Mali government in Bamako. And we also know that there has been an uncomfortable, let me put it this way, actually Andy, I keep forgetting his last name, but it'll come back to me. But he is a writer who has been doing a great deal of work over in Mali. And for him, he sees, yes, he says that the Tuaregs, who live in the north section, the desert section, and yes, they are a minority, they live pretty much in peaceful times. They live together, but they don't get any help from the government in Bamako. And actually, when in I think it was 1960, when the French left, they tried to set up a separate Tuareg state because the Tuaregs really wanted that. They said they were peaceful. There's a tradition there, a Sufi tradition I'll go into in a little bit. But it did not come to pass. But that, when the French were leaving, they actually were trying to help that this country, which they are calling now Azawad, to become a reality.
So you're saying that this Azawad country has been in the French mind for a long time, for a longer time than we think?
Well, they were aware. I mean, the Tuaregs came to them and said, if you're leaving, we want our own country. Now, the interesting thing is their own country is not all of Mali. When they talk about Azawad, it is really basically three provinces, Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal. And they claim no interest in taking over the rest of Mali. And they're quite a long distance from Bamako and the rest of Mali. And what you have is a situation where, yes, what's happened in Libya has changed the rules, because for the first time in their history now, the Tuaregs are armed and have weapons. There were about 2,000 that came in from Gaddafi's. They were working for Gaddafi.
Yeah, and it seems to be that Gaddafi used to be a great supporter of this regime, though, that collapsed in Mali. And Libya used to have a lot of businesses, has a lot of businesses in Mali.
Well, that's why, in the sense, Afghanistan and Mali are so similar, is that they are the crossroads. Of in Mali, it's the trade route through the Sahara, from the north through the Sahara to the south. And in Afghanistan, it's the route from Asia, deep Asia, Central Asia, through Afghanistan, which determined whether or not the British were going, or the Russians were going to be able to control industrial output. So in a sense, these are both situations where they are sort of like the pivot point here.
I see. So whoever controls Mali controls what?
Whoever controls Mali really controls trade in the region.
Trade in West Africa.
In West Africa.
Just like whoever controls Afghanistan is
going
to...
The control of Afghanistan means whether or not you get the gas and from north of Afghanistan, or the oil from the Caspian, and of course many other things at this point. So what is it that Mali has, for example, being in its pivotal position? We know that it has gold. We know that nearby Niger has uranium, and that there is suspicion that there is uranium also in Mali. And there is the French started their explorations for oil in northern Mali back when they were in control, and there are certain reserves. I think Chris said they were minor reserves, but I don't think so. From what I've been reading, I think they could be quite large, and they happen to be under the sands that the Tuaregs live on. So if you have a people that are causing trouble, that's a real good excuse, as one person says, to go in and get rid of them.
I see. So this is pretty much a setup for the Tuareg because they think they're having a revolution, but really what their aim is to take their land because they're on a very, very valuable land. So they'll send in armies, interventions, this and that to crush the Tuareg, but then take over their land, which take over Mali pretty much.
That would be the takeover of Mali.
Mm.
In other words, in the opinion of most of the people that I talk to and read, is that the Tuaregs are really only interested in their area.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes pretty much sense, because if you follow the nomadic routes, there are nomadic people that cross the desert, go north, and they come south. Mm-hmm. And their interest is in those two ports, as they call them. In the desert, there are ports, just as we have in the oceans. You know,
mm-hmm.
Across the ocean.
Yeah.
Now, whether they will start flexing their muscles and want more than that, no one knows. But here is the critical thing that I think that's happening, is that the Al-Qaeda group, which they call themselves AQIM, we'll call them Al-Qaeda, have been at work using Mali as their center since basically 2000, year 2000. Mm-hmm. So why is it that now, when I say using Mali as their center, I'm referring to the other parts of Mali. The Tuaregs actually despise the Al-Qaeda, and they look upon Al-Qaeda as one of the reasons that they are being looked upon as trouble. Mm-hmm. They claim that, and they're quite loud about it, is that they have no interest in the AQIM or working with them in any way. Mm-hmm. Because one thing is for sure: if you get associated, if one decides to make you sound, through words and through diplomacy, through media, connect the Tuaregs to Al-Qaeda, then you have it's like a poison. I mean, because then you'll have a war against the Tuaregs that's going to wipe them out.
Yes.
So in this sense, I think Chris is absolutely right. The economy of what's happening in the north is going to determine a great deal of what happens in the rest of Mali. Mm-hmm. If it becomes a war against the Tuaregs, now there are only 2,000 but they are well trained. There's no question about it. And the military that is the 7,000 that make up the military of the government in Bamako. It's interesting that the U.S. has been training their top people. They bring them over to the United States.
The men who actually took over power militarily has been trained by the United States.
That's right. He was well trained, and of course we don't know, but that connection is very suspicious. And we do know that in Tasilit, America does have a base of operations, and I guess working through AFRICOM, and very closely connected with ECOWAS, which is the group of nations that sort of surround. There are 14 nations in the area that Mali is sort of in the center of.
Yes.
So it's right in the center of the chessboard. It's not a big chessboard in the sense of Afghanistan or Pakistan, but it could have tremendous implications for example, if we are going to, it's on the road to actually claiming that all Muslims are Al-Qaeda. And the Tuaregs in particular despise the Al-Qaeda, and they're very bright people. They have a tradition which is very interesting. The Sufis from that region, which of course includes Timbuktu and the oldest library in Africa, I guess since the library in Alexandria was burned. But this is a Muslim library. It was people came from all over Africa and the Middle East, North Africa, to study there from the 15th century, 16th century, even the 17th century. It's they're still only holding it together. It could use some gaffer tape, as we say in the film business, to put it back together. But this particular area has a group of Sufis that have been getting together. They call themselves the ambassadors of peace, and that the resolution of conflict can be done through dialogue, tolerance, and forgiveness. And that is the basis of many of the writings that are in this library. And there are nearly 1 million manuscripts of Islamic doctrine that were recorded in Mali from the 12th century through the 16th century.
Yes.
And these people meet every day in what they call the circle.
Yeah. It's a very rich culture in Mali, and I have been to Mali. Most of the people in Mali were Muslims, and they were very, very peaceful. It was so amazing coming from the West, always hearing about Muslim terrorists, and then going to an Islamic country like Mali, Islamic in quotes, really, and finding them so peaceful, so beautiful, so just chilling and loving their country, loving life.
That's absolutely true. And when we were there the first times in 1999, there was peace. Yes, let's
talk about that.
Everywhere.
You have a 14-part series on Africa. Let's talk about that. You have a 14-part series on Africa. You have been shooting in many, many places in Africa, right? So
many places over many years, many situations. And the series is called Into Africa, but we're just now at the point of going into, everything is shot. All the material has been shot, and we're about to go into negotiations and for the posting, which is the editing and finalization of the shows. So we're at a point here with these 14 shows that we would love to see them as part one. If there were a 4-part series on Africa that would be ongoing, you would have one, the exploration.
Yeah.
2, you would have exploitation.
Yeah.
3, you would have liberation. And 4, expectation. Because there's a lot of expectation of what Africa could be now. And so I think there are. I don't think it's a given that Mali has to go this route. But from the WikiLeaks papers, there is, and one can read them. They're right there to be read. There seems to be a genuine connection between the government in Bamako and the Secret Service of Algeria and Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda has been hanging. That's where they hang out. That's where they killed a 70-year-old man. They crossed over the border. They come back.
Yeah.
So why are they tolerated there? They are not tolerated in the Tuareg North. There are Al Qaeda is in big trouble when they go there.
Yeah.
And there was an actual battle that took place. It's the only big battle against Al Qaeda that has taken place, and it was between the Tuaregs and Al Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
So we have something here that is economic for sure, but we have something that has to do with tradition. We have something to do with a difference in people's opinions of things, what they want out of life. I mean, what may happen, what could happen, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but you might have that separate Tuareg state, which is northern Mali.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the rest of Mali, because the Tuaregs make up only 10% of the population. But they do sit on top of a lot of oil.
And they have cut off a huge chunk of the country. So, if it's about redefining African borders, all the African borders are fiction because they were defined by Europeans in Berlin anyway.
I love the story that when Queen Victoria was reigning, this was back before World War I, and I think it was her nephew, the Kaiser Wilhelm, was the president of Germany, and he was moaning because he didn't have any big mountains in his part of Africa, which is Tanzania, right? So Auntie Victoria decided to give him Kilimanjaro, or so the story goes, and the very fact that people took it casually meant that they drew lines through everything. And that, if you want to go back to the situation in Afghanistan, which I think our film really shows, is the lines that were drawn there, separating Pakistan and Afghanistan by the British back in 1896, are probably the biggest cause of what is going on in that area.
I see. I'm so sorry to have interrupted you when you were speaking about the Kilimanjaro. So let me get this straight. Victoria, Queen of England, her cousin, the German Kaiser,
right,
which the royal family of England is German anyways.
Yes.
So they divided Africa among themselves, and then the cousin said that he doesn't have any mountains in his part. That's
right. He's moaning and groaning. So his aunt decides to give him Kilimanjaro.
So that's how Kilimanjaro is kind of the border between Tanzania and Kenya?
Well, it's all in Tanzania now. But, of course, you can see it from Kenya. My goodness, the view of Kilimanjaro from Kenya is magnificent. It's probably the best view of it. But, I mean, this is how the various countries in Europe, more than America in this sense, far more, divided up Africa. They divided tribes. They divided families. In Afghanistan, they literally divided the Pashtun people. And these people, the Pashtuns, are a rugged and very determined traditional lot. And they ran a line right through the area of the Pashtuns to create a border that was completely false, because it was, both sides were people of the Pashtun tribal affiliation.
Yeah.
So when you have all these borders and all these lines that have been created by the Europeans, this is blowback too.
Yeah.
It's not just giving guns to the wrong people. It's when you draw lines between peoples that are the same.
This is a continuation of those divisions.
It is.
Do you see any similarities between the division of Mali and the division of Sudan? Because the people of South Sudan think that they had independence, But it appears to be that they just have received a huge chunk of the country that's really, really rich, and now they just get to supply to a different power. There's no real freedom.
Well, boy, the Sudan is another story. It's a wonderful and
Mali
incredible
heading
story.
to the situation of Sudan, it's fake separation.
Yes, and I don't think it will stay fake for long. I think there will be definite changes. But once again, you have a creation of states, but in this case, at least there is some ethnic connection. There is some justification in a real sense between the separation.
The Arabs in the north and the black Africans in the south?
If they don't get along, and the black Africans in the south have gone through such such torture. It's tragic. Mm-hmm. But now, as you say, okay, they have land. What are they going to do? So, once again, we look upon Europe when they came in to various remote regions of the world at that time, and they just drew lines. And the lines today are being challenged in a very big way.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think? What would you tell the people of Mali, because you have been there, and clearly we're going back to shoot part 2 because I have also been there to shoot a documentary.
Well, the people of Mali, and including the Tuareg, there's a lot of happiness, a lot of dancing, a lot of enjoyment in Mali, and there is truth that the Bamako government has not looked after the Tuareg very, very well at all.
But when I visited Mali, I went to the north, to Mopti, to the villages.
Yes.
It's not just the Tuareg. The government was not looking after these other people also.
That's
they
right.
could also take up guns and say the government is not looking after us. I mean, the images and the footage that I have is so heartbreaking. They have all this beautiful land, beautiful people, but the government is not investing any money into education, any money into health, no money into water. Water was a huge, huge issue when I was visiting Mali. But like you say, the people's spirit is just so wonderful. I can't believe they would bring horror and war to such a peaceful people, because, I'm from a war country, We're a war people. We have been at war for a long time. But Mali, was so peaceful. That was one of the reasons why I chose to go to Mali, because it was unlike Rwanda, where I come from. They were such a peaceful people.
Yeah, and look what happened.
Yeah. So before we go, what was your personal experience with Mali? And so what would you tell the people that you have met or that you want to see again?
I would tell them to accept the fact that the Tuareg living in the north and the other people, as you said, in Mopti, not just the Tuaregs, they want space. They want a little respect. I think if they're given that respect by not only the government in Bamako, but if they are considered Al-Qaeda, which at this point the facts are that they simply are not. They want nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. They don't want their own goals to liberate that north and have it be Azawad. They don't want that compromised by those people. So I think if I were an average Malian, I would say, don't rush off and start believing things that you hear, everything that you hear. And don't necessarily believe that people that you thought were honest might not have been corrupt, and people who were corrupt might not have been a little more honest than you think. I think it's basically a country that has a tradition of working out its problems. I think the Sufi connection is very strong. I think this need not be what it's heading towards. But if the international forces are determined to get more uranium and more oil out of the region, as one writer has put it, you could see the genocide of the people living in the north.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having been with us. The people can find you on the website Shadow of Afghanistan. His name is Jim Burrows. So you have heard, do not be trapped in the middle of an international war. The people should be able to work things out peacefully like they have always done between themselves, because otherwise they are just puppets of international war.
That's right. Just the pawns that get moved around the chessboard.
Yes.
And people can actually contact and get the Afghanistan DVD at, it's called Cinema Libre.
Yeah.
Store.
Cinema Libre store on the internet, cinemalibresstore.com, right?
That's it. Cinema Libre, Libre, store.com, and that, I think people would find some insight from that.
Now, you have won awards. How do people win awards with documentaries?
Well, of course, documentary is the poor relation in the feature film world to feature films. But one thing about a documentary that differs completely from news reporting is that we try to connect the dots, and that means that if you have an event, I'll never forget when we were watching the shock and awe of Iraq being blown up. There was nothing in terms of the history of what was going on, what was being destroyed, why it was being destroyed. There were no weapons of mass destruction, but there was more to the story than that. And the documentary filmmaker tries to take a situation and put it in a historical context so that you get some insight. But as one of the right hands of an ABC told me once, right to my face, ABC is not really interested in the news. We're interested in entertainment.
That's the major difference between you and the news. You actually want people to understand what's going on, but the mass media is only interested in entertainment. It's not news, it's entertainment. That was a very interesting quote that you told me earlier from, was it Peter Jennings at ABC?
Well, it was one of his, not Peter himself, because I think he was a bit above that, but was one of his hirelings, one of his right hands.
Mm-hmm. They're not in the business of facts.
We're not in the business of facts. We're in the business of entertainment.
Wow. There you have it, listeners. And we're in the business of understanding.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Jim, for being on the show, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Louise.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, all my international people, for being with us on the show. That was the show on Mali. You have heard it for yourself. Do not be a puppet in this war that the superpowers have decided to go into. Work out your own issues locally, peacefully. Have a great evening, and much love to all my people of Mali. Iniche, Ala Kausara. I've forgotten a little bit of the Bambaha that I learned there. Have a great evening, my international people. This is Louise Uwachu, broadcasting live from Vancouver,